Records buried in the Wilkinson County Courthouse mention a plantation that operated under a system so disturbing, local officials tried to erase its existence from public documents after the Civil War. For 23 years, between 1835 and 1858, the Jessup family plantation operated what neighboring landowners privately called the breeding operation, a systematic program where the plantation owner, his wife, and all 5 of their children participated in forced reproduction with enslaved people to maximize profit and secure generational wealth. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just what happened, but how methodically it was planned, how willingly the entire family participated, and how completely the surrounding community chose to look away. The Jessup ledgers, discovered in a locked trunk in 1962, documented everything with the cold precision of livestock records, except these were human beings. Before we continue with the story of the Jessup plantation and how an entire family convinced themselves that breeding human beings like cattle was simply good business, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And please, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're watching from. Now let's go back to Mississippi in 1835 to understand how this horror began. Wilkinson County, Mississippi in 1835 was cotton country, where fortunes rose and fell with each harvest. The Jessup plantation sat on 1,200 acres of rich delta soil, about 8 miles northeast of Woodville, the county seat. Isaiah Jessup had purchased the land in 1829 with inheritance money from his father, a tobacco merchant from Virginia who had made considerable profit supplying Confederate forces during various conflicts. Isaiah was 31 years old when he bought the property, newly married to Ruth Cavendish, daughter of a plantation owner from South Carolina. Ruth was 23, educated in Charleston, and came from a family that had operated a large rice plantation for 3 generations. The Jessup plantation grew cotton primarily, but also maintained vegetable gardens, a small orchard, and livestock. By 1835, Isaiah owned 42 enslaved people, a modest number compared to the largest plantations in the area, but substantial enough to mark him as a man of means. The plantation house was a 2-story structure with white columns, built in the Greek Revival style that was popular among wealthy Southerners of that era. 6 bedrooms upstairs, a large dining room, a study for Isaiah, and a parlor where Ruth entertained the wives of other plantation owners. Isaiah and Ruth had married in 1830, and their first child, Thomas, was born in 1831. Then came Samuel in 1833, Margaret in 1835, Daniel in 1837, and finally Elizabeth in 1839. 5 children in 8 years. Ruth managed the household with the help of enslaved domestic workers, while Isaiah spent his days overseeing the fields, traveling to Natchez to conduct business, and maintaining relationships with cotton brokers and other plantation owners. To anyone observing from the outside, the Jessups appeared to be a typical wealthy plantation family of the antebellum South. They attended church every Sunday at the Woodville Presbyterian congregation. Isaiah served on the county agricultural board. Ruth participated in ladies' charitable societies. Their children received education from a private tutor, a man named Charles Whitfield from Kentucky, who lived in a cottage on the property and taught the Jessup children reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture. But inside the plantation house, behind closed doors, Isaiah and Ruth were having conversations that would have shocked even the hardened sensibilities of their slave-owning neighbors. Isaiah had become obsessed with a particular problem that plagued many plantation owners: the constant need to purchase new enslaved workers. Prices had been climbing steadily throughout the 1830s. A healthy adult male field worker could cost anywhere from $800 to $1,200, a significant investment. When enslaved people became too old to work, or died from disease or injury, that investment was lost. Isaiah spent hours in his study, poring over his account books, calculating expenses, projecting future costs. Ruth, who had grown up watching her father manage a large plantation, understood the economics of slavery as well as any man. Her father had always maintained that the most profitable plantations were those that could grow their own workforce, meaning encouraging reproduction among enslaved people to create new workers without the expense of purchase. This was common practice throughout the South, but the Cavendish plantation had taken it further. Ruth's father had systematically paired enslaved people he considered strong or healthy, sometimes separating families to create what he believed would be optimal breeding pairs. Ruth brought these ideas to her marriage, but Isaiah wanted to go further. During the winter of 1834, when Ruth was pregnant with Margaret, Isaiah proposed something to his wife that would shape the next 2 decades of their lives and the lives of everyone on their plantation. He suggested that instead of merely encouraging reproduction among enslaved people, they should directly participate in it themselves. His reasoning, as he explained it to Ruth, was purely economic. The children born from such unions would be enslaved by law, following the condition of the mother, but would carry Jessup blood, which Isaiah believed would make them stronger, healthier, and more valuable. These children could be kept to work the plantation or sold at premium prices. Either way, it would be, in his words, investing in our future prosperity. Ruth did not reject the idea immediately. She thought about it for several weeks. She prayed about it, she later told her children. She consulted the account books. She remembered her father's methods, and eventually she agreed. But she added one condition. Their children would be raised knowing this was their duty, their contribution to family prosperity. When the time came, all of them would participate. The family would operate as a unit, maximizing production, ensuring the plantation's success for generations. This was not a decision born from sadism or perversion, though the results would be horrific. This was calculated, methodical, economic planning dressed up as family duty. And once Ruth agreed, they began preparing their children for what would be expected of them. Thomas Jessup was only 3 years old when his parents began his education. He could not have understood the full implications of what he was being taught, but the lessons started early. Isaiah and Ruth spoke openly at the dinner table about the enslaved people on the plantation as property, as investments, as breeding stock. They used the same language they used when discussing horses or cattle. Thomas heard this language from his earliest memories. It became normal to him. By the time Thomas was 8 years old in 1839, he understood what would be expected of him when he came of age. His father explained it during one of their walks around the plantation. Thomas would help grow the workforce. It was a son's duty to contribute to family prosperity. Isaiah framed it as responsibility, as maturity, as the mark of a man ready to take his place in managing the family enterprise. Samuel received the same education. So did Daniel. The girls, Margaret and Elizabeth, were taught differently but with the same end goal. Ruth explained to them that bearing children was a woman's purpose, and that bearing children who would increase family wealth was the highest purpose of all. She taught them that enslaved women were beneath them in all ways, and that using them for family benefit was no different than using them to cook meals or wash clothes. They were tools, resources. The children grew up isolated. They had few friends outside the family. Their tutor, Charles Whitfield, taught them reading and mathematics, but the truly formative education came from their parents. By 1845, Thomas was 14, Samuel was 12, Margaret was 10, Daniel was 8, and Elizabeth was 6. The household operated on a strict schedule, meals at the same time every day, church on Sundays, work during the week. Isaiah increasingly involved Thomas in plantation management, teaching him to inspect the fields, to evaluate the health and productivity of enslaved workers, to think always in terms of profit and loss. The Jessup children did not question what they were taught because they knew nothing else. They had no outside perspective. No contrary voice. Their tutor never challenged Isaiah's authority. The Presbyterian minister who visited the plantation saw only a prosperous, well-ordered household. Other plantation families who interacted with the Jessops noticed nothing unusual, or if they did, they said nothing. The culture of the antebellum South was one of privacy regarding what happened on a man's own property. What a plantation owner did with his enslaved people was his business. On a humid evening in May of 1848, when Thomas turned 17, Isaiah called him into the study after dinner. Ruth was there, sitting in the corner chair. Thomas sat across from his father's desk. Isaiah explained that Thomas was now a man, and it was time for him to fulfill his duty to the family. A young woman named Hannah, who was 20 years old and worked in the kitchen, had been selected. She would be brought to Thomas's room that night. Thomas did not refuse. He had been prepared for this moment his entire life. It was expected. It was duty. That night marked the beginning of the systematic breeding program that would define the Jessup plantation for the next decade. Hannah became pregnant within 3 months. She gave birth to a boy in May of 1849. Isaiah recorded the birth in his ledger with satisfaction. He named the child Isaac, wrote "property of Jessup Plantation" next to the entry, and estimated the child's future value at maturity. Hannah was returned to kitchen work within 2 weeks of giving birth. The baby was cared for by an older enslaved woman named Claudia, who had raised many of the enslaved children on the plantation. Thomas continued his duties. Over the next 3 years, he fathered 4 more children with 3 different enslaved women. Samuel began his participation in 1850 when he turned 17. Daniel began in 1854. The daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth, were expected to bear children as well, but in their case the father would be enslaved men selected by Isaiah for what he considered desirable physical characteristics: strength, health, good teeth, clear eyes. Margaret turned 18 in 1853. Ruth spent months preparing her psychologically for what was coming. Margaret did not resist. She had been taught her whole life that this was normal, expected, righteous even. An enslaved man named Jacob, who was 25 years old and worked as a blacksmith on the plantation, was brought to Margaret's room on a Saturday night in November. Margaret became pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter in August of 1854. Ruth insisted that Margaret continue her participation. Over the next 4 years, Margaret had 3 more children. Elizabeth followed the same pattern when she turned 18 in 1857. By that point, the system was well established. The family operated with cold efficiency. Isaiah maintained meticulous records. Ruth managed the household and supervised the pregnancies and births. The sons performed their assigned duties. The daughters bore children. The enslaved people had no voice, no choice, no escape. What made the Jessup operation particularly disturbing was not just the forced reproduction, but the systematic nature of it. Isaiah treated it like agriculture. He rotated which enslaved women were paired with his sons to avoid what he called overuse of any individual. He tracked menstrual cycles. He provided better food rations to pregnant women, not out of compassion, but to ensure healthy births. He separated mothers from children at age 3, believing that early separation prevented emotional bonds that might interfere with productivity. The plantation ledgers from this period, which survived and were eventually discovered, are chilling in their detail. Each birth is recorded with the mother's name, the date, the child's sex, any notable physical characteristics, and an estimated future value. The children fathered by Isaiah himself, and he did participate beginning in 1850 when Thomas had proven the viability of the system, are marked with a small notation in the margin, J direct line. These children, Isaiah believed, would command the highest prices if sold, or would be the most productive if kept. By 1855, the plantation population had grown from 42 to 68. 26 of those were children under the age of 10, all born as part of the breeding program. The Jessup family wealth increased substantially. Isaiah expanded his land holdings, purchasing an adjacent 300 acres. He built a new barn, a cotton gin building, and additional slave quarters to house the growing population. He was considered one of the most successful planters in Wilkinson County. Life on the Jessup plantation followed a brutal rhythm. The field workers rose before dawn, worked until dark, returned to their cabins exhausted. The house servants worked slightly shorter hours but were under constant supervision. Children born into slavery on the plantation were put to light work by age 5, carrying water, picking vegetables, running errands. By age 10, they were in the fields or learning trades. The family grew, but families were not allowed to truly form. Isaiah's policy of early separation meant that mothers and children spent only the first 3 years together, and even during that time, the mothers were working. The older woman, Claudia, who cared for the youngest children, did her best to provide some maternal comfort, but she was managing a dozen infants and toddlers at any given time. The psychological impact on the enslaved people was profound, though their suffering was not recorded in Isaiah's ledgers. They lived in constant fear, constant vigilance, knowing that any woman of childbearing age could be selected, that any child born would be taken, that resistance meant punishment or death. Some tried to resist. A woman named Sarah attempted to run away in 1851 after being forced to bear her third child fathered by Samuel Jessup. She made it 17 miles before being captured by a slave patrol. She was returned to the plantation, whipped publicly as punishment, and locked in a small storage shed for 2 weeks, with minimal food and water. When she was released, she no longer spoke. She worked silently for the rest of her life, died of pneumonia in 1863, and was buried in the unmarked section of the plantation cemetery. The Jessup children, Thomas, Samuel, Margaret, Daniel, and Elizabeth, all participated in the system their parents created, but they were not identical in their responses. Thomas, the oldest, seemed to accept his role with little visible emotional conflict. He managed sections of the plantation, oversaw field work, conducted business in town, and fathered children with enslaved women as directed. He married a woman named Virginia Gentry from a neighboring plantation in 1853, but this did not change his participation in the breeding program. Virginia either did not know the full extent of what occurred on the Jessup plantation, or she chose not to acknowledge it. Samuel, the second son, showed signs of distress as early as 1852. He began drinking heavily, often disappearing for days at a time. Isaiah punished him for neglecting duties, but Samuel's drinking only worsened. By 1855, he was functional but clearly miserable, speaking little, avoiding eye contact with both family and enslaved people. He never married. He continued his participation in the breeding program until 1858, but with increasingly erratic behavior. Margaret, after the birth of her fourth child in 1857, began experiencing what Ruth described in letters to her sister as melancholic episodes. Margaret would lock herself in her room for days, refusing meals, speaking to no one. Ruth treated this as a temporary weakness that required discipline, not sympathy. Margaret was not permitted to stop her participation. She had a fifth child in 1859, shortly before the breeding program began to collapse. Daniel and Elizabeth, the youngest, had grown up so thoroughly immersed in the system that they seemed to view it as completely normal. They participated without visible hesitation when their time came. This total acceptance might have been the most disturbing aspect of all, demonstrating how completely a person could be shaped by their environment, how thoroughly an evil practice could be normalized. But cracks were beginning to show. The enslaved population of the plantation had grown too large for the existing infrastructure. Housing was crowded. Food rations, though adequate by the standards of the time, were stretched thin. More significantly, the children fathered by the Jessup family were becoming old enough to understand their parentage. By 1857, some of these children were 8 or 9 years old enough to wonder why they looked different from other enslaved children, why they had lighter skin or different hair texture. The older enslaved people on the plantation told them the truth, quietly, in the privacy of the quarters after dark. This created an atmosphere of resentment and tension that even Isaiah's strict discipline could not completely suppress. The enslaved people knew which children belonged to which family member. They knew the system. They hated it. But they were powerless to stop it, and any organized resistance would result in brutal punishment or sale to plantations further south, where conditions were even worse. Neighboring plantation owners began to notice things. The Jessup plantation population had grown unusually quickly. The demographics were odd, too many young children in proportion to adults. A few whispered conversations occurred among plantation wives about Ruth Jessup's daughters and their unexplained pregnancies before marriage. But this was the antebellum South, where social cohesion among the white planter class was maintained by silence on uncomfortable topics. As long as the Jessups conducted themselves appropriately in public, which they did, no one would confront them directly. Isaiah himself seemed immune to any moral qualms. His letters from this period, some of which survived in family collections, discuss plantation management with other owners, cotton prices, political developments, and various business matters. He mentions the success of his breeding program in economic terms only, comparing his results to those achieved with livestock breeding. There is no indication of guilt, no moment of doubt, no recognition that he was committing profound evil. He had created a mental framework in which enslaved people were not fully human, and within that framework, his actions were logical, even commendable. He was being a good steward of his resources. He was building generational wealth for his family. Ruth's perspective, glimpsed through occasional letters she wrote to her sister in South Carolina, was similar. She worried about her children's health and futures, but these worries were purely practical. Whether Thomas would successfully inherit the plantation, whether Samuel's drinking would become a serious problem, whether the daughters would eventually marry well despite their participation in the breeding program. She never expressed concern for the enslaved women who were being raped, or the children being born into bondage, or the psychological damage being done to everyone involved. In her worldview, enslaved people were property, tools, and their suffering was irrelevant. The absolute moral blindness of the Jessup family was not unique to them. Thousands of plantation owners throughout the South operated under similar assumptions. What made the Jessups unusual was the systematic involvement of the entire family, the multi-generational planning, the cold calculation. Most forced reproduction on plantations was opportunistic, driven by individual owners' exploitation of enslaved women. The Jessup program was different. It was organized, methodical, a family business. The year 1858 brought changes that would begin to unravel the system Isaiah and Ruth had built. In February, Charles Whitfield, the tutor who had educated the Jessup children for more than 2 decades, died suddenly of a heart condition. He was 57 years old. His death meant the family lost someone who, through his silence, had enabled their operation. Whitfield had known. He had lived on the plantation for years, had seen the pattern, had observed the growing number of mixed-race children. He had never said anything to anyone outside the plantation. His complicity through silence was as damaging as active participation. After Whitfield's death, Isaiah decided the younger children no longer needed formal tutoring. Elizabeth, at 19, was considered educated enough. Daniel, at 21, was already managing significant portions of the plantation. The family could operate without an outsider living on the property. This decision increased their isolation even further. In April, an enslaved woman named Rose, who was 32 years old and had borne 5 children as part of the breeding program, fell severely ill with what was probably tuberculosis, though it was not diagnosed as such at the time. She coughed blood, ran high fevers, lost weight rapidly. Ruth, concerned about the potential for disease to spread through the enslaved population, ordered Rose isolated in a small cabin at the far edge of the quarters. Rose died 3 weeks later, alone, separated from her children. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave. Rose's death affected the enslaved community deeply. She had been well liked, had quietly provided comfort to other women forced into the breeding program, had sung hymns in the evenings that could be heard across the quarters. Her death and burial, rushed, unmarked, with no ceremony, was seen as an indication of her worthlessness in the eyes of the Jessup family. Anger simmered. That summer the cotton crop suffered from boll weevil infestation, reducing yield significantly. Isaiah's income dropped. He needed to sell some of the enslaved children who were now old enough to work to raise cash. In August, he sold 6 children, ranging in age from 8 to 12, to a slave trader who transported them to Louisiana. 4 of those children had been fathered by his sons. He separated them from their mothers without ceremony, loading them into a wagon early one morning and sending them away. The mothers were not permitted to say goodbye. This event broke something in the enslaved community. The passive acceptance that had characterized the previous decade gave way to quiet rage. The enslaved people began talking among themselves about the possibility of escape, about the rumors they had heard of the Underground Railroad, about the increasing tensions between North and South over slavery. Some of the younger men talked about violence, about rebellion, though the older people cautioned against it. The memory of the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831 and its brutal suppression was still fresh in Southern collective memory. Open rebellion meant death. Samuel Jessup's drinking reached a crisis point in September. He was found unconscious in the barn one afternoon, having consumed most of a bottle of whiskey. Isaiah had him carried to the house, berated him when he regained consciousness, and threatened to disinherit him if the behavior continued. Samuel promised to reform, but the promise was empty. His nightly drinking continued. He began to neglect plantation duties entirely. Thomas had to take over Samuel's responsibilities. Margaret's mental state also deteriorated. In October, after the birth of her 5th child, a son she was not permitted to keep, who was taken from her after 3 days and given to Claudia to raise, Margaret attempted to harm herself. The specific method was never recorded, but Ruth's letter to her sister mentioned that Margaret had been prevented from a rash action and was being closely supervised. Margaret was confined to her room for 3 weeks under Ruth's watch. When she emerged, she was pale, thin, and hollow-eyed. She spoke only when directly addressed. She moved through the house like a ghost. The emotional and psychological strain on the Jessup family was becoming visible, but they could not or would not acknowledge its source. Isaiah attributed Samuel's drinking to weakness of character. Ruth attributed Margaret's depression to female hysteria. Neither connected their children's suffering to the monstrous system they had created and enforced. The fundamental premise that enslaved people were property and could be used however the family saw fit remained unquestioned. In November, a traveling Methodist minister stayed overnight at the plantation while passing through the county. His name was Reverend William Foster, and he was from Pennsylvania, traveling through the South to observe conditions and report back to his congregation. He ate dinner with the family, said Grace, engaged in polite conversation. But he noticed things. He observed the unusual number of young children in the slave quarters, noted the physical similarities between some of those children and the Jessup family, saw the haunted look in Margaret's eyes and the drunken glaze in Samuel's. Reverend Foster did not confront the family directly. That would have been socially impossible and potentially dangerous. But after he left the plantation the next morning, he made notes in a journal he kept. Those notes survived. They describe his suspicions about what was occurring on the Jessup plantation, his horror at the implications, and his sense of helplessness. What could he do? He was a northerner with no authority in Mississippi. Slavery itself was legal. Even if he reported his suspicions to local authorities, they would do nothing. Plantation owners had almost absolute control over their enslaved people, as long as they did not murder them outright, and even that was rarely prosecuted. They faced no consequences. Reverend Foster's account, published years later in a collection of testimonies about slavery, is one of the few external confirmations that something deeply disturbing was happening on the Jessup plantation in the 1850s. He described the atmosphere as oppressive beyond the usual oppression of slavery, and noted that the enslaved people I observed seemed to live in a state of terror that went beyond normal fear of punishment. December brought cold weather and the end of the cotton harvest. The reduced yield meant financial pressure on Isaiah. He spent long hours in his study, reviewing accounts, calculating how to maintain profitability. His solution was to intensify the breeding program further. He instructed Thomas and Daniel to increase their participation. He selected 3 additional enslaved women he considered suitable. He set targets, a specific number of births he wanted to achieve in the coming year. On Christmas Day, the Jessup family attended church in Woodville, as they did every Sunday and major holiday. They sat in their usual pew, sang hymns, listened to the sermon. The minister, Reverend Donald Patterson, spoke about duty, family, and Christian virtue. The Jessups nodded in agreement. After the service, they socialized with other plantation families on the church lawn. Ruth discussed recipes and household management with other women. Isaiah talked politics with other men. The children stood quietly, well-dressed and well-behaved. To every observer, they appeared to be a model family. That afternoon, back at the plantation, Isaiah gathered the family in the parlor. He announced his plans to expand the breeding program in the coming year. He explained his expectations for each family member. He emphasized the importance of productivity, of maximizing returns, of ensuring the plantation's prosperity. His tone was businesslike, as if he were discussing crop rotation or equipment maintenance. The children listened. Even Samuel, despite his drinking, nodded acceptance. This was their normal. This was what they had been taught their entire lives. But something was shifting. The slaves in the quarters had begun quietly organizing. A man named Josiah, who was 26 years old and had been born on the plantation, had been making contact with enslaved people on neighboring plantations during Sunday church services, when plantation slaves were sometimes permitted to attend. He gathered information about possible escape routes, about sympathetic whites who might help, about the tensions brewing between North and South that might present opportunities. He shared this information carefully, only with people he trusted completely, knowing that one informant could destroy everyone. The stage was set for confrontation. The Jessup family believed they were in complete control, that their system was functioning smoothly, that they could continue indefinitely. The enslaved people knew otherwise. They understood that change was coming, whether through escape or through the political upheaval that everyone could sense approaching. The question was not whether the system would end, but how, and how much blood would be spilled in its ending. The events of 1859 shattered the careful structure Isaiah Jessup had built. The collapse began not with external intervention, but from within the enslaved community itself, driven by desperation and rage that had built for more than a decade. On a February night, when the moon was barely a sliver in the sky, 3 enslaved women, Hannah, Rachel, and Julia, made their attempt. Hannah was the woman Thomas had first been paired with 11 years earlier. She had borne 5 children, all taken from her. Rachel had been Samuel's first, mother of 4. Julia had borne 3 children fathered by Daniel. All 3 women were in their late 20s or early 30s. All 3 had reached a point where death seemed preferable to continuing their existence on the Jessup plantation. They left separately to avoid suspicion, planning to meet 2 miles north at a creek crossing they had scouted during previous Sunday walks to the neighboring plantation's church services. The plan was to follow the creek north, travel only at night, head toward Tennessee and then possibly further north. Josiah had provided them with the little information he had gathered about routes and contacts. They made it 6 miles before being discovered missing at morning roll call. Isaiah immediately sent Thomas and Daniel with 2 trusted enslaved trackers and dogs to hunt them down. The dogs picked up the scent quickly. The women were found hiding in a ravine by early afternoon. They had no weapons, no real chance of escape. They were brought back to the plantation in chains. Isaiah ordered a public punishment. Every enslaved person on the plantation was required to watch. The 3 women were whipped, 10 lashes each, tied to posts in the yard between the main house and the quarters. Ruth watched from the porch. The children watched from windows. The screams carried across the fields. After the whipping, Isaiah made a speech. He stood before the assembled enslaved people and explained that the women had been ungrateful, had rejected the good treatment they received on his plantation, had attempted theft, for they were stealing themselves, which was theft of his property. He warned that any future escape attempts would be punished more severely. He reminded them that they were fortunate to be on the Jessup plantation rather than somewhere with harsher conditions. The speech was met with silence. The enslaved people stood motionless, faces carefully blank, revealing nothing. But inside, the hatred intensified. Hannah, Rachel, and Julia were locked in a small storage building for 3 days with minimal food and water, then returned to work. Hannah could barely walk for weeks due to infection in the whipping wounds. Rachel developed a fever that lasted for days. Julia survived physically, but something had broken in her mentally. She worked mechanically, responded when spoken to, but the light had gone from her eyes. Samuel Jessup witnessed the whipping from his bedroom window. He was drunk, as he was nearly every afternoon by that point. The sight of the women being punished, women he had been forced to rape repeatedly by his father's system, triggered something. That evening, he confronted Isaiah in the study. The argument was loud enough to be heard throughout the house. Samuel accused his father of cruelty, of creating a system of horror, of destroying everyone it touched, including his own children. Isaiah responded with cold fury. He told Samuel he was weak, ungrateful, a disappointment. He told him that if he could not fulfill his duties as a son, he would be cut off from the family entirely. Samuel shouted that he would rather be cut off than continue participating in the breeding program. Isaiah struck him. The blow knocked Samuel to the floor. Isaiah stood over his son and told him that he would continue his duties or leave the plantation immediately with nothing. Samuel left. He walked out of the house that night, took a horse from the barn and rode toward Natchez. He never returned to the Jessup plantation. Samuel's departure shocked the family. Ruth wept, more from embarrassment than grief. Thomas increased his work to compensate for Samuel's absence. Margaret retreated further into silence. Daniel and Elizabeth seemed unaffected, continuing their roles in the system without comment. Isaiah refused to speak of Samuel, forbidding anyone from mentioning his name. But Samuel's confrontation had exposed the reality they all knew but never acknowledged. The system was built on violence, on the destruction of human souls, and it was destroying the Jessup family as surely as it destroyed the enslaved people they brutalized. Spring brought more trouble. Several enslaved children fell ill with measles, an outbreak that spread quickly through the crowded quarters. 2 children died. One of them was a 4-year-old girl named Clara, who had been fathered by Thomas. It was the first time one of the children directly descended from the family had died on the plantation. Isaiah noted the death in his ledger as a financial loss. Thomas said nothing publicly, but he attended the child's burial in the slave cemetery, standing at a distance, watching as the small body was lowered into the ground. Margaret became pregnant again in April. This was her 6th pregnancy, and her psychological state had deteriorated so severely that Ruth began to worry she might not survive childbirth. Margaret barely ate, spent hours staring out her bedroom window, flinched when anyone approached her. Ruth tried various tonics and treatments, but nothing helped. Margaret was trapped in a nightmare of her parents' creation, and there was no escape. In May, Josiah and 4 other enslaved men made their escape attempt. They were better prepared than the women had been. They had gathered supplies secretly over months: food, tools, a stolen knife. They left on a Saturday night when the White family was asleep and made it almost 20 miles before being discovered missing on Sunday morning. Isaiah sent Thomas and Daniel with a larger party to search. This time the search took 3 days. Josiah's group had split up, making tracking harder. Eventually all 5 were captured separately and brought back. The punishment was brutal. Isaiah had them whipped severely, 20 lashes each. Josiah, as the leader, received 30. Then Isaiah did something he had never done before. He sold all 5 men immediately to a slave trader who transported them to Louisiana sugar plantations, where working conditions were notoriously harsh and life expectancy was short. He wanted to send a message that escape attempts would result not just in punishment, but in exile to worse situations. The sale of Josiah and the others devastated the enslaved community. Josiah had been a leader, someone people looked to for hope. His removal left a void, but it also confirmed what everyone already knew. There was no mercy on the Jessup plantation, no recognition of their humanity, no limit to the suffering that would be inflicted to maintain the system. Margaret went into labor in late July. The birth was difficult and prolonged. Ruth attended her, along with an enslaved midwife named Beulah, who had delivered dozens of babies on the plantation. Margaret screamed for hours. The baby, when it finally came, was a boy. Margaret held him for perhaps 30 seconds before losing consciousness. She did not wake up. She died 2 hours later from blood loss and complications. Margaret's death struck the family in ways that previous suffering had not. She was one of their own, a white woman, a daughter. Her death could not be dismissed or rationalized away. Ruth collapsed in grief. Thomas and Daniel stood in shocked silence. Elizabeth locked herself in her room. Isaiah retreated to his study. The funeral was held 3 days later. Margaret was buried in the family cemetery on the plantation, marked with a proper stone. The Presbyterian minister gave a eulogy about God's mysterious ways and the consolation of faith. Neighboring plantation families attended and offered condolences. No one mentioned the circumstances of Margaret's pregnancy or the system that had contributed to her death. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Wilkinson County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The baby Margaret had died delivering survived. Isaiah named him Matthew and had him sent to the quarters to be raised by Claudia, along with all the other children born from the breeding program. The boy's existence was a reminder of Margaret's death, and the family wanted him out of sight. After Margaret's funeral, something shifted in Ruth. She had been an active participant in the breeding program, had supervised pregnancies, had enforced her husband's rules without visible guilt. But her daughter's death broke through the psychological barriers she had constructed. She began to question quietly whether what they had done was worth the cost. She did not express this to Isaiah. He would have dismissed it as grief-induced weakness. But she confided in Elizabeth that she wondered if God was punishing them. Elizabeth, the youngest daughter, did not share her mother's doubts. At 20 years old, she was the most thoroughly indoctrinated of all the Jessup children. She had never known a world different from the one her parents created. Margaret's death saddened her, but she did not connect it to the breeding program. To Elizabeth, it was simply the danger of childbirth that all women faced. She continued her participation without hesitation, becoming pregnant again in September of 1859. Thomas, now 28 years old and effectively managing the plantation in his father's stead as Isaiah grew older and more withdrawn, began to recognize the unsustainability of the system. Not from moral awakening, Thomas had been too thoroughly shaped by his upbringing for that, but from practical observation. The enslaved population was growing increasingly hostile. Productivity in the fields had declined. The atmosphere of resentment and fear was palpable. The cotton yields were not matching the increased labor force. Something had to change, but Thomas had no idea what form that change should take. The autumn of 1859 brought news from the outside world that would eventually end the Jessup breeding program, though they did not know it yet. In October, a man named John Brown led a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, attempting to start a slave rebellion. The raid failed. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. But the incident sent shockwaves through the South. Plantation owners everywhere tightened security, increased patrols, and viewed their enslaved people with heightened suspicion. Isaiah responded by implementing stricter controls on the Jessup plantation. No enslaved person could leave the property for any reason, even the supervised church visits on Sundays. Evening curfew was moved earlier. The number of white overseers was increased from 2 to 4. Men hired from town to patrol the quarters and fields, armed with rifles and whips. The plantation began to feel like a prison, which in truth it had always been. But now the bars were visible and the guards were everywhere. The increased security made life even more unbearable for the enslaved people. They could not gather in groups larger than 5 without an overseer demanding to know what they were discussing. Their cabins were searched randomly for any contraband, tools that might be used as weapons, food that might be stored for escape attempts, anything that suggested independent thought or planning. Punishments for minor infractions became more severe. A man named Robert was whipped for talking back to an overseer. A woman named Dinah was locked in the storage shed for 2 days for being late to field work. The pressure was building toward an explosion, and in December of 1859 it came. On the night of December 18th, a Sunday, when the white family was asleep and the overseers were making their rounds at the far end of the property, fire broke out in the cotton gin building. The flames spread quickly, fed by stored cotton and dried wood. By the time anyone noticed, the entire structure was engulfed. The alarm was raised. Everyone, white family, overseers, enslaved people, rushed to fight the fire, forming bucket lines from the well, desperately trying to prevent the flames from spreading to other buildings. They saved the main house and the barn, but the cotton gin burned to the ground, along with a significant portion of the stored cotton waiting to be processed. The financial loss was devastating, but more significant was what Isaiah found the next morning when he inspected the ruins. Evidence that the fire had been deliberately set. Remnants of oil-soaked rags, placed strategically to maximize damage. Isaiah immediately ordered an investigation. He gathered all the enslaved people and demanded to know who had set the fire. No one spoke. He threatened mass punishment. Silence. He had the overseers search the quarters, looking for any evidence, any indication of guilt. Nothing was found. Frustrated and enraged, Isaiah selected 3 men at random, Peter, Moses, and James, and had them whipped as an example, 20 lashes each, in front of the assembled enslaved population. He told everyone that until someone confessed, random punishments would continue. He would destroy them all if necessary to find the guilty party. But no one confessed, because everyone was guilty. The fire had been set by a group of 7 people working together, carefully chosen for their trustworthiness and their shared determination. They had planned it for weeks, waiting for the right moment. The fire was not meant to kill anyone. It was set at night when the building was empty, but to strike at Isaiah's wealth, to cost him money, to demonstrate that they were not completely powerless. The fire marked a turning point. The enslaved community had moved from passive resistance and escape attempts to active sabotage. They understood that they could hurt their oppressor even if they could not free themselves. Over the following months, other incidents occurred. Tools went missing. A fence critical for containing livestock was damaged, allowing pigs to escape. A supply of seed corn stored for spring planting was found contaminated with dirt. Isaiah responded with increasingly harsh measures, but each punishment only deepened the resentment and determination. The plantation had become a war zone, though the war was largely invisible to outside observers. To neighboring plantation owners, the Jessup property still appeared prosperous and well-managed. They noticed the burned cotton gin, but fires were not uncommon on plantations. They had no idea of the seething conflict beneath the surface. Thomas tried to counsel his father toward moderation, not from compassion, but from pragmatism. The harsh punishments were making the enslaved people less productive, more dangerous. But Isaiah would not hear it. He had spent 24 years building his system, and he would not abandon it now. The breeding program would continue. Control would be maintained. His will would prevail. Ruth, meanwhile, had retreated almost entirely from active participation in plantation management. Margaret's death had broken something in her that would not heal. She spent her days in her room, reading scripture, praying, writing letters to her sister in South Carolina that revealed a mind slowly fragmenting under the weight of guilt she could no longer suppress. In one letter from January 1860, she wrote, "I fear we have sinned greatly, and God's judgment approaches. My daughter is dead. My son is lost to drink and exile, and I wake each night hearing screams that may be real or may be echoes of all the years past." Elizabeth gave birth to her second child in February 1860, a girl. Like Margaret before her, Elizabeth was immediately expected to resume her participation in the breeding program. Unlike Margaret, Elizabeth showed no signs of psychological distress. She had been too young when the program began, had absorbed her parents' worldview too completely to develop the moral conflict that had destroyed her sister and brother. Elizabeth was, in some ways, the program's greatest success and its most horrifying product. A person so thoroughly indoctrinated that she felt no guilt for participating in systemic rape and enslavement. As winter turned to spring in 1860, political tensions between North and South reached a breaking point. Abraham Lincoln's presidential campaign, with its platform opposing the expansion of slavery into new territories, was seen by many Southerners as an existential threat. Plantation owners throughout Mississippi began discussing secession, preparing for possible conflict. Isaiah attended meetings in Woodville, where local leaders debated their response to Northern aggression, as they termed it. Isaiah was consumed with defending slavery in the abstract, the Southern way of life, states' rights, property rights, while being blind to the specific horrors he had created on his own plantation. He could give passionate speeches about the biblical justification for slavery, about the economic necessity of the institution, about the supposed happiness of enslaved people under benevolent masters, while forcing his own children to rape women he owned and separating mothers from babies. The cognitive dissonance never seemed to register. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December. Mississippi followed in January 1861. By February, 7 Southern states had formed the Confederate States of America. War was coming, though few people in early 1861 believed it would last long or cost much blood. The prevailing opinion in Mississippi was that the North would back down, that Southerners' superior military tradition would ensure quick victory, that the world would not allow the cotton supply to be disrupted. The Jessup Plantation continued its operations through these political upheavals, but the approaching war created uncertainty. Thomas and Daniel were of military age and would likely be expected to fight. The plantation's workforce might be reduced if enslaved men were impressed into service building fortifications or working for the Confederate Army. The breeding program, which had been the focus of family efforts for more than 2 decades, suddenly seemed less important than survival in a changing world. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the Civil War began. Thomas enlisted in a Mississippi regiment within weeks. Daniel followed in May. Isaiah, at 53 years old, was too old for military service. He remained on the plantation with Ruth, Elizabeth, the hired overseers, and the enslaved population of 73 people, a population that included dozens of children fathered by the Jessup men. With Thomas and Daniel gone, the day-to-day management of the plantation fell to Isaiah and the overseers. The breeding program continued, but with less intensity and organization. Isaiah was aging, increasingly plagued by health problems. Ruth was barely functional, spending most of her time in her room. Elizabeth managed the household, but had neither the authority nor the inclination to oversee field operations. The war years were chaotic. The Union blockade of southern ports made it difficult to sell cotton. Confederate currency became increasingly worthless. Food supplies were diverted to feed the army. The plantation began to decline. Buildings needed repairs that were not made. Fields were planted and harvested, but the work was done with less supervision and increasing resentment. The enslaved people on the Jessup plantation heard rumors of Union advances, of enslaved people escaping to Union lines and gaining freedom, of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Hope began to replace despair. They understood that the world was changing, that the system that had held them in bondage was collapsing. They waited. Thomas Jessup was killed at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. Daniel died of dysentery in a military camp in Virginia in 1863. Both deaths devastated Isaiah. His sons, whom he had raised to inherit and continue his plantation empire, were gone. His dream of a multi-generational dynasty built on the breeding program died with them. Ruth died in her sleep in August 1864. The doctor said it was heart failure, but it might more accurately have been described as the final collapse of a woman who had lived too long with guilt she could acknowledge but not escape. She was buried next to Margaret in the family cemetery. By early 1865, the Jessup plantation was a shadow of what it had been. Isaiah was 67 years old, in failing health, increasingly confused. Elizabeth, now 26, managed what she could, but the situation was beyond her control. The enslaved people were barely working, waiting for the Union Army that everyone knew was coming. The overseers had left, either to join the army or to flee north. The plantation buildings were deteriorating. The fields were partially planted but poorly tended. In April 1865, news reached Wilkinson County that the Confederate Army had surrendered. The war was over. Slavery was ended. The world the Jessups had built and defended was gone. Union troops arrived in Woodville in May. An officer came to the Jessup plantation to inform Isaiah and Elizabeth that the enslaved people were now free. Isaiah, weakened by stroke and confined to a wheelchair, could barely comprehend what he was being told. Elizabeth understood but refused to accept it. She argued with the officer, insisted that the people on the plantation were her property, demanded compensation for the loss. The officer explained that there would be no compensation, that slavery was abolished by constitutional amendment, that she needed to accept reality. The formerly enslaved people of the Jessup plantation gathered their belongings and left. Some went immediately, walking away the same day they learned of their freedom. Others stayed for weeks, uncertain where to go or how to survive in a world they had never known as free people. By July, only a handful remained, mostly elderly people who had nowhere else to go. Hannah, the first woman forced into the breeding program, left with her surviving children. She walked north, eventually reaching Memphis, Tennessee, where she found work as a washerwoman and lived until 1889. Rachel went west toward Vicksburg with her children. Julia, who had never recovered psychologically from the trauma of her years on the plantation, stayed for several months, unable to make the decision to leave, until other freed people finally convinced her to come with them to a Freedmen's Bureau camp where she might receive help. The children fathered by the Jessup men, those who survived to see freedom, scattered. Most took names different from Jessup, wanting no association with their father's family. Some became farmers, working their own land. Some moved to cities. A few managed to get education and became teachers or ministers. They carried the trauma of their origins throughout their lives, but they were free. Isaiah Jessup died in October 1865. The cause was listed as complications from stroke, but more fundamentally, he died because the world he understood had ended, and he could not adapt. He was buried in the family cemetery next to Ruth and Margaret. No one mourned except Elizabeth. Elizabeth tried to maintain the plantation after her father's death, but it was impossible. She had no workforce, no money, no credit. The cotton gin had never been rebuilt after the fire. The buildings continued to deteriorate. In 1867, she sold the property for a fraction of its former value to a northern investor who planned to divide it into smaller farms to be worked by free labor. Elizabeth used the money to move to Mobile, Alabama, where she lived with distant relatives. She never married, never spoke publicly about the plantation or her family, and died in 1891 at age 52. Samuel Jessup, the son who had fled the plantation in 1859, survived the war years working various jobs in Natchez and New Orleans under an assumed name. He never stopped drinking. He died of liver failure in 1872, estranged from his remaining family, leaving no heirs and few possessions. His death went largely unnoticed. The Jessup plantation itself was divided into 4 separate farms by 1870. The main house, stripped of its furnishings and left abandoned, slowly collapsed over the following decades. By 1900, nothing remained but the foundation stones and a few outbuildings. The slave quarters rotted and fell. The family cemetery, overgrown and neglected, became difficult to find. The cotton gin site was plowed under and planted with crops. The children born from the breeding program, and their descendants, spread throughout the South and eventually across the country. Most never knew the full story of their origins. The trauma was too great to speak of, and the surviving mothers who had endured the program rarely told their children the details of their conception. The secret was buried with each generation. The Jessup ledgers, which documented the breeding program in meticulous detail, survived by accident. They were stored in a locked trunk that ended up in the possession of a descendant of Ruth's sister in South Carolina. That descendant, cleaning out an attic in 1962, discovered the trunk and the ledgers inside. Shocked by what they revealed, the descendant donated them to a university archive, where they became available to historians researching the realities of slavery. Those ledgers, along with scattered letters, county records, and the oral histories eventually collected from descendants of enslaved people who survived the Jessup plantation, provide the evidence for what occurred between 1835 and 1865. The story is documented, verifiable, and profoundly disturbing. The Jessup case was not unique. Historical research has revealed numerous instances of plantation owners forcing enslaved women into sexual relationships, of systematic breeding programs designed to increase enslaved populations, of families participating in these practices across generations. What makes the Jessup case notable is the documentation, the cold, detailed records that Isaiah kept, treating human reproduction as livestock management. The psychological impact on everyone involved was devastating. The enslaved women who were raped repeatedly, who bore children they were not allowed to raise, who lived in constant fear and degradation, suffered trauma that affected them for the rest of their lives and was passed down to their children. The Jessup children, raised in a system of systemic abuse, were themselves damaged beyond repair. Thomas and Daniel died young in a war defending the system that had poisoned their souls. Samuel drank himself to death, trying to escape his guilt. Margaret died giving birth to her 6th child from the breeding program. Elizabeth lived longer but never found peace or happiness. Ruth and Isaiah, the architects of the system, lived long enough to see it collapse, but never acknowledged the evil they had created. They died believing they had been good Christians, responsible plantation owners, victims of northern aggression and economic forces beyond their control. They never accepted moral responsibility for the suffering they caused. The most chilling aspect of the Jessup case is how normal they appeared to their contemporaries. Church members who knew them for decades described Isaiah as a devoted family man, and Ruth as a pious woman who read scripture daily. Business associates considered Isaiah honest in his dealings, prompt in paying debts, reliable in his contracts. Neighbors saw the Jessup family as pillars of their community. No one intervened because no one believed intervention was necessary. The horror was hidden in plain sight, protected by the legal framework of slavery and the social conventions that prevented questions about what happened on a man's property. The enslaved people who survived the Jessup plantation carried their trauma silently for years after emancipation. In the 1930s, when the Federal Writers Project conducted interviews with formerly enslaved people as part of documenting American history, several individuals who had lived on the Jessup plantation were interviewed. Their testimonies, recorded in aged voices but with vivid memories, confirmed the breeding program's existence. An elderly woman named Patience, who had been born on the plantation in 1854, told her interviewer, "Mr. Jessup, he run that place like he was God himself. He decided who born, who live, who sold away. His own children did what he said, every one of them. We wasn't people to them. We was crops they was growing." These oral histories, preserved in Library of Congress archives, corroborate the documentary evidence found in the ledgers. What happened on the Jessup plantation between 1835 and 1865 was legal under the laws of Mississippi and the Confederate States. That is perhaps the most disturbing fact of all. Isaiah Jessup was never charged with a crime, never investigated by authorities, never held accountable in any legal sense. The system of slavery gave him absolute power over the people he owned, and he used that power to create a nightmare that lasted 3 decades. His family participated willingly, shaped by their upbringing into believing that their actions were not just permissible, but admirable, a demonstration of business acumen and family loyalty. The Jessup breeding program was slavery operating exactly as the system was designed to operate, reducing human beings to property, stripping them of agency, exploiting them for profit, and destroying them without consequence. The children born from the breeding program numbered at least 47 according to Isaiah's ledgers, though the actual number may have been higher, as some births likely went unrecorded, particularly those that resulted in infant deaths. Of those 47 documented children, approximately 30 survived to see emancipation. Their descendants today number in the hundreds, spread across the United States, most unaware of their connection to the Jessup plantation or the circumstances of their ancestors' births. DNA testing in recent years has confirmed genetic links between individuals descended from the enslaved population and individuals descended from the Jessup family, providing scientific verification of what the historical records already documented. Some descendants have sought each other out, creating connections across racial lines born from shared trauma. Others prefer not to know, finding the truth too painful to confront.